Hey folks, welcome to Phrase by Phrase with Pastor Rick. This is the channel where we study the Bible phrase by phrase in 5-minute chunks. Last time we looked at verse 5 that said that God gives wisdom to us when we ask. He gives generously and without reproach, but there is a condition. And in verse 6 he begins to describe that. He says, but he must ask in faith without doubting. So God will give wisdom to those who are in trial and are seeking that mind of Christ to understand how to behave in a Christ-like way in the midst of our trial. But this person has to ask in faith, and they have to ask without doubting. Now, the word doubting is the word diakrino in the Greek, and it means to judge between the two or to distinguish between the two. It's speaking almost like of two options. A picture that I like of this word is like you're walking down a trail and you come to a fork in the road and you can't decide which fork to go down. You go to the left and then you kind of second guess yourself, and maybe you go back to the right and you start down that way and you second guess yourself again, and you're back and forth vacillating. You just can't decide which way to go. That's the meaning of this word. And so the question might be, well, what are the options then? What are we talking about when it says don't doubt? You're asking for wisdom, you're asking for the mind of Christ, and so what would you be doubting when that happens? Well, remember, we're not talking about answers. When God gives wisdom, it's not like he's doing a fill in the blank, giving you answers and saying, turn left here, turn right here, do this, do that. We're asking for our minds to be renewed. We're asking that God would reshape our thinking so that we see life from God's perspective, that we have the mind of Christ. That's what wisdom is about. Well, that'll be immensely helpful in trial. But that also spills over into the rest of our lives. And that's really where the rub comes in. Because the question would be, do you want to change your way of looking at the world even when you're not in trial, when things are going great? You know, I mean, what are we asking for when we ask for the mind of Christ? Do we really want that? Because here's what this means. If you think about the mind of Christ and how he behaved, when you're asking for that, you're asking for this. Listen to what Paul writes in Philippians chapter 2, verse 3. He says, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. Have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking on the form of a bondservant, and being made in the likeness of men, being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So Jesus considered the needs of others more important than himself. He lowered himself in order to lift others up. That's the mind of Christ. So when we're praying for wisdom and we're asking God to help us to view the world through his eyes and to see it the way he sees it and to think his thoughts the way he thinks, that's the mindset that Jesus has. So we're not just asking for wisdom to know what to do in the trial. We're asking for a total makeover in terms of how we think and how we behave. And that's the small print. That's what we're being called to do. So the person who doubts is the person who vacillates because they want wisdom for the trial, but they're not sure they want that total makeover when we start looking at the mind of Christ. And so they vacillate between the two, and yet this has to be resolved. You know, Paul writes about this same idea in the book of Romans. In chapter 12, verse 2, he says, do not be conformed to this world, or don't let the world squeeze you into its mold. So do not be conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. So this renewing of your mind, taking on the mind of Christ, is going to transform you. And I love that word transformed because it's the same word that transfiguration comes from. When Jesus was transfigured, the reality of who he is began to shine out through his humanity, and he became bright white like the sun, right? So this internal reality was allowed to shine through. So when we're transformed, we're transfigured, and that the life of Christ that's in us begins to shine out through our lives. So be transformed, be transfigured by the renewing of your mind, that you may be able to prove, Romans says, that which is good and acceptable in the perfect will of God. In other words, you're going to be able to live out the will of God. You're going to be a walking example of God's will. You're going to be walking in the wisdom of God, living the ways, thinking the ways of God in this transformation process. That's what we're praying for when we ask for wisdom. However, there's a price to that, because verse 1 in chapter 2 starts off this way. It says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present yourselves a living sacrifice unto God, which is your spiritual, reasonable service of worship. So you're to present yourself as a sacrifice, a living sacrifice. We lay self down and we allow the life of Christ to take up residence, so he controls our lives and he expresses himself through our lives. That's the small print. That's the price that's paid for the wisdom of God. So James is saying, if you lack wisdom, you're in a trial and you need to know, how do I think the way God thinks? How do I see the situation the way God sees it? Well, I need wisdom. And so I'm going to pray for wisdom, but when I'm praying for wisdom, to be able to walk through this trial in a way that glorifies God, I have to take on the mind of Christ. And that mind of Christ means I have to empty myself and put others first instead of putting self first. So that's what we're really praying for. And he says, if you're double-minded like that, you can't do that. You can't vacillate between the two. It's an all or nothing deal. You're in and you're all in, or you're out. You think about that. God bless you.